We all knew what to paint. Bread, work, vote. But the message was workers of the world, unite. Everyone was going to have equal rights, and that included the artists.
Comrades, we are passing through one of the most critical, the most important moments of history. A moment when the world's socialist revolution is in the making. We need to mobilize the masses to progress fast. Art is the most powerful means of political propaganda for the triumph of the socialist cause.
We are breaking with the past because we cannot accept its hypotheses. We ourselves are creating our own hypotheses, and only on them, as in our own inventions, can we build a new life and a new world view. More than anyone else, the artist knows this intuitively and believes in it absolutely. That is exactly why artists, above all, undertook a revolution.
My search for the new art for a new world started here in St. Petersburg, where for centuries the vast Russian Empire had been controlled from the Winter Palace by the Tsars, who believed they had the divine right to rule with no elected government. They enjoyed a privileged life, while 80% of Russians were peasants. Despite the abolition of serfdom in 1861, they still had no rights. So in the early 1900s, the peasants flooded into the cities from all over the empire, desperately seeking work. They formed the proletariat and united with a revolutionary approach to politics and to art. For over a decade, and through the First World War, discontent had been growing against Tsar Nicholas II. After the mass riots at the Women's Day March of February 1917, the Tsar was forced to abdicate and power ceded to the provisional government. But despite this, the voiceless people grew angrier. So how did the artists respond? In July 17, photographer Victor Buller stood here at his studio window and took one of the most iconic images of the 20th century. As the government troops opened fire on the crowd at a demonstration below. In this street, on that day, hundreds were injured and dozens lay dead. With tensions rising, the Bolshevik Party was gaining in popularity, and in October, The awaiting crowd hailed the return of their exiled leader.
Comrades, with all my might I urge you to realize that everything now hangs by a thread. We must not wait. We may lose everything. The government is tottering. It must be given the death blow at all costs.
Many young artists were at the vanguard of the movement and joined the optimistic crowds on the streets, looking forward to a new utopia.
Они все были революционеры. Они чуть ли не на баррикады ходили и вообще, так сказать, боролись за революцию. Поэтому для них это был прорыв в новый мир от устаревшего мира, который всем надоел. Это порыв любой молодежи. Им же тогда было по 18-20 лет. Естественно, они стремились куда-то вперед.
Finally, the Bolsheviks closed in on the headquarters of the provisional government, the Tsar's Winter Palace.
The whole revolution was planned at the example of the French Revolution. So there was storming of Bastille, so you have to, and storming of Tuileries, so you had to storm Winter Palace. So it was part of the performance, and then it was made a performance. The famous film of Eisenstein, October, which shows the storming of the Winter Palace, is an absolute lie.
Russia's pioneering film director, Sergei Eisenstein, would portray the version of events the Bolsheviks wanted remembered. His masterpiece, October, which has influenced filmmakers ever since, depicts the armed masses heroically streaming into the Winter Palace.
Nothing of this time ever happened. There was no storming, no, only very few armed people who just got in and arrested the provisional government. It was peaceful. The Winter Palace was taken by the revolutionaries without big fight. And they have been cutting the portraits of the Tsars, which have been hanging in some of the places. This was most of the damage what happened in the Winter Palace.
With the Bolsheviks now in power, and Tsar Nicholas under house arrest in the Ural Mountains, the court photographer Boason captures here an aristocratic era now at an end. The entire family were later executed by a firing squad and thrown down a mine shaft. In 1918, the capital was moved to Moscow. Successive layers of history have buried this extraordinary period of turmoil. To find out more about the life and death survival of the great avant-garde artists, I wanted to delve beneath the anonymous face of the metropolis, go into the archives and meet surviving descendants, many of whom are working artists in Russia today. Why don't you just start off by telling me who was your great-grandfather?
My great-grandfather was an artist who lived in Moscow during the period of revolution.
Fedor told me that his great-grandfather worked right here in this Moscow apartment 100 years ago.
Through the open windows he heard the church bells, which inspired him to create his architectural pictures. Lentulov loved very much Russian architecture, but especially at the time of revolution, and he depicted crowds of moving people on background of old Moscow churches.
Long before 1917, a huge artistic revolution was already well underway, but it took the famous political events to unlock the massive outpouring of creativity in all fields of art.
From 1900 or 1902 or 1903 up to 1915, Russian art became
are, I would say, the most avant-garde in the whole of the world.
A giant in the avant-garde was Kazimir Malevich. His anarchistic attitude coincided perfectly with the Bolsheviks and their promise of political change.
Malevich, he's working on the theory of suprematism in Vitebsk. There were a group of people connected with Malevich, and he was a crazy man with his idea of suprematism.
I have broken the blue boundary of color limits, come out into the white. Besides me, comrade pilots swim in this infinity. I have established the semaphore of suprematism. I have beaten the lining of the colored sky, torn it away, and in the sack that formed itself, I have put color and knotted it. Swim. The free white sea lies before you.
The new step he did is trying to show ideas, not to show existing reality. His art is not about reality. He's very idealistic, the way world can be structured. And this obviously comes from the cosmos.
I mean, there are certain pieces that were wonderful, certain pieces were completely absurd. And they're still absurd, but they're considered as a masterpieces, but they're absurd. Like Black Square, I think is absurd.
So can you explain to me what is the Black Square all about?
Well, Malevich had, of course, painted the Black Square in the summer of 1915 and exhibited it at the end of 1915. And he placed his Black Square in the corners of the room, across the corners of the room, in the position that an icon would have occupied in a Russian domestic interior. So he was imbuing his Black Square with the metaphysical and spiritual connotations of the icon.
Religion is opium for the people. Religion is a sort of spiritual booze in which the slaves of capital drown their human image, their demand for a life more or less worthy of man. The yoke of religion that weighs upon mankind is merely a product and reflection of the economic yoke within society.
The mass movement of denying God or church by the young generation was extremely strong. As Dostoevsky said, you know, if God, there is no God, everything is allowed. You can do everything if there is no God. So that was the basis of Russian Revolution. There were very young people that accepted the revolution immediately. And they fought White Guard, they fought church, they fought everything, trying to, first of all, destroy the old without thinking what they're going to build instead.
The Black Square is the end of the world and the beginning of a new world, like the big deluge, the big end. It's the symbol of the new beginning, and to begin something anew, you need to end everything that was before, but everything. And that's the Black Square.
The communist ban on religion would result in the systematic destruction of architectural symbols of worship. They chose Russia's most prominent cathedral of Christ the Saviour in Moscow and reduced it to rubble. For centuries, Russia's ruling classes had looked to Europe for cultural influence. and the artistic scene was dominated by the Imperial Academy of Arts in the then capital Petrograd, where teaching was traditional figurative art.
The students, mostly they are coming to academy to study classical art. And we are doing it from mid-18th century till today. And it's the system of academy.
But by the beginning of the 20th century, the young artists wanted to break all these rules.
It was the conflict between the school and the new way of thinking and the new way of doing art, new strategy. Some of them came to change the world, because I think these artists, they think that they could change the world.
The academy is a mouldy vault in which art flagellates itself. Art no longer cares to serve the state and religion. It no longer wishes to illustrate the history of manners. It wants to have nothing further to do with the object as such, and believes that it can exist in and for itself without things. I have transformed myself in the zero of form and dragged myself out of the rubbish-filled pool of academic art.
Well, artists were really confronting the academy and the powers that be with art which outraged them, which was simplified, which was dramatically kind of colourful, ignored perspective, really did all the things that were against the academy. And because of the connection between the imperial household and the imperial academy, their rebellion against the academy had a political connotation from the very word go.
They were trying to be more modern, more avant-garde than the West. And that was very typical for Russian artists, that kind of extremist, I would say terrorist in art, in a sense even.
Painters flourished in this utopian period, including one of the greatest, Vasily Kandinsky. He was known as the father of abstraction and would change the course of painting forever.
Abstract art places a new world, which on the surface is nothing to do with reality, next to the real world. Each colour lives by its mysterious life. In every painting, a whole is mysteriously enclosed.
Кандинский — это такая непростая история взаимоотношений с русской революцией. Кандинский тоже, как и все художники, беспредметники. Он, конечно, создал вот такое свое новое направление, абстракция. Но абстракция Кандинского, она никогда, на мой взгляд, не была оторвана, в отличие от малевичевской супрематизма, она не была оторвана абсолютно от изображения. То есть он всегда перемешивал вот свою абстракцию с некими такими фигуративными образами, которые почти исчезали.
I let myself go. I thought little of the houses and trees, but applied colour, stripes and spots to the canvas. Within me sounded the memory of early evening in Moscow. Before my eyes was the strong, colour-saturated scale of light and atmosphere which thundered deeply in the shadows.
This era generated a massive number of very diverse artists, encouraged by the new freedom of expression. But not every one was in favour of the revolutionary avant-garde movement. In 1917, the Moscow-based painter Pyotr Konchalovsky, part of a cultural dynasty, was already a well-established and prolific artist.
What about the politics? How did he fit in with the political events in Russia? Was he a political animal?
At that time, the artists of left wing, the artists of avant-garde, they want to go more left, more revolutionary than it's supposed to be. My grandfather was, doing naturemorts and portraits, and I think he started to be regarded by that revolutionary part of artists as a conservative person. But he was very satisfied with this point of view. He didn't want to jump on this wagon of modern art, that it was always far beyond even cubism. It started to go to abstract. And he stayed with the truth, as he realized. For him, the truth was Cézanne. If you analyze the background, just a wall, you analyze the colors that I used in the gray, you realize that it's not a gray. It's a full rainbow of colors that gives you more gray than gray itself. That's Cézanne.
A huge amount of art produced in this period was piled up in museum stores, surviving for decades as only a myth. In St. Petersburg, I was fascinated by this treasure trove of unique work by an individual called Pavel Filonov. Barely known outside Russia, he remains an enigma in the West. I was drawn in by the tiny little brushes Filonov used to show every atom in the human body. He created his own formula of the revolution in a new style which he called analytical realism. Filonov had a big following because he came from a very simple background as sixth son of a cabman. The workers felt he was one of them, and they really liked his art. The Bolsheviks appointed the art critic, Nikolai Punin, as their arts commissar. He was close to Malevich and one of the most passionate supporters of the avant-garde movement.
Он всех их очень высоко ценил, несмотря на то, что они очень разные, очень разнообразные по своему творчеству, по своему устремлению. Отношение к революции менялось очень сильно на протяжении всей его жизни. Может быть, в первые революционные годы он был романтиком. И он считал, что, может быть, революция – это какое-то очищение.
Since the artists were on the breadline with no money for paint, they needed worker status to get food coupons. But Commissar Punin could help them, and a new visual arts department was set up. The grand surroundings of the former Tsar was where they met.
We're here to discuss art and art for the masses. I want to know what you all propose for the promotion of our glorious October 1917 revolution.
Avant-garde artists were the ones who were young, they were keen, they wanted to participate in all the new artistic reforms. They were the ones who were at the right time, at the right place.
Present it to people in the form.
They were artists from different sides of Russian avant-garde, and quite often they couldn't even agree on the same developments in Russian art.
How is a black square relevant for that?
Because a black square can be shaped.
You're saying it's like you created the shape.
I didn't create the shape, I created the concept.
You're asking somebody who wears clogs, who's never seen a picture in his life, to come and have a look at it and actually take it seriously.
Yes, that person understands a square, doesn't he or she?
All people understand emotion.
Exactly.
No one understands a black square on a white
black
background.
Square can mean anything.
You put forth a singular idea understood by a bunch of pseudo-intellectuals that means nothing to anyone.
We have to be looking at the next 100 years.
What's going to be hanging in the Winter Palace in 100 years' time?
Exactly.
What do you
Will
think?
it be the Black Square? I've got a pretty good idea it could be the Black Square.
Thank you, Stan.
I think it's pretty unlikely to be the Black Square.
Could evolve into the yellow circle.
The Bolsheviks turned to the avant-garde artists who were quite enthusiastic about this revolution because this coincided with their concepts of the world, which is for 100% changing. So it was a kind of a combination of circumstances which brought them together.
Lenin announced a decree for the immediate switch at the Institute of Arts in Moscow and Academy of Arts in Petrograd from traditional to avant-garde art.
So it was the free artist studio, then the Institute of Proletarian Art, then another one. After 1918, it were a lot of changes inside the academy. New professors like Petrovodkin. And he is from outside, he's not from academy.
I should say that Petrovodkin was the first artist who used the spherical perspective in his paintings, in still lifes, in the landscapes. It was the conception of three colors and spherical dimension, spherical perspective.
Восхищение и уважение – это вот те чувства, которые у меня связаны с именем Петрова-Водкина, моим дедушкой. Он родился в маленьком городке в Хвалынске на берегу Волги в семье горничной и сапожника.
Петров-Водкин к революции отнесся восторженно. И, как известно, он был одним из 6 деятелей культуры, которые пришли добровольно работать с советской властью. Он был уверен, что творческие силы вот русского народа, они смогут подняться и совершенно новую страну сделать.
Very soon after the October Revolution, Lenin announced his plan for monumental propaganda.
Comrades, I intend to decorate Russia's squares with statues and monuments to revolutionaries and the great fighters for socialism, the likes of Karl Marx and the heroes of the French Revolution. These monuments will be street pulpits from which fresh messages will flow and inspire the consciousness of the masses. We must make a marriage of convenience with the artists who are keen and democratic. My plan for monumental propaganda needs to be executed fast and efficiently.
At the time, they couldn't afford to make sculptures out of bronze, for example, so it was all temporary materials, so they often were not very well preserved, especially with Russian winters.
I uncovered this rare archive film in Moscow. It's about the only record of these propaganda sculptures, as barely any have survived to this day.
They were mainly heroes from the French Revolution, Italian rebellions, because they didn't have enough really Russian heroes at the time. A lot of sculptures to tsars and generals who were popular in Imperial Russia were removed and replaced by the new sculptures. So it was a victory of new art over the old. It was quite fascinating how in the first years after the revolution, at the time of starvation, when there was no electricity in Petrograd, people were freezing, starving, huge funds were allocated for decorations of the city.
The core thing of this square, that was the main square of the Russian Empire. Natan Altman, who was the artist of the revolution, he did several very nice designs of the square, like using this column as a center and making a star around it, that's a red star, and also different slogans were appearing everywhere. I would say the revolution established this connection between art and politics, because politics wanted artists to create its world, wanted artists to create the image of the new country, and that's why artists were engaged to play with the revolution.
Another artist, the legendary Marc Chagall, was commissioned to decorate his hometown of Vitebsk, here at the celebration of the first anniversary of the Bolshevik uprising. He was liberated by the revolution. Previously, Jews were prohibited to move beyond the Pale, the line of settlement established by the Tsars, 100 kilometers away from Moscow and Petrograd.
The revolution gave all the Jews freedom to come, because they were just people of new country, as they could come and go. And of course he was inspired by this new revelations that the revolution brought up.
Much of Chagall's subject matter is symbolic of his Jewish roots in his hometown, where he and his wife Bella grew up. This important work is one of Russia's gems and shows the liberating power of art and imagination over repression.
This painting of floating figures is absolutely a dream, is something that can't happen. And this is a dream that comes from this small village that with very, very prescribed life and very detailed everyday living. He's trying to fly out, come to a dream, to a love story. And that is, of course, the dreams that were given by the new reality that he was living in.
I discovered that the Russian avant-garde flourished across all cultures, including the stage. The revolution opened doors to brand new radical artists who enthused each other with their ideas. Theatre director Vsevolod Meyerholt was a member of the Bolshevik Party. His quirky experiments in unconventional new Soviet theatre were very popular. Rarely practiced today, this technique for training actors, known as biomechanics, was used to learn movement and express emotion physically by assuming poses and gestures. Another pro-revolutionary artist was Alexander Rodchenko. Aged 26 at the time of the revolution and highly prolific, he taught at the same Moscow art school where his grandson lectures today.
So can you please describe your grandfather, what kind of artist he was?
I have the image of a very tall figure whom I definitely know that is my grandfather. Later on, after my mother Varvara's stories, I learned a lot of him. We can consider Rodchenko to be the founder in many areas. Almost on every lecture we somehow remind our students of his heritage, because he worked as a multifaceted artist in so many areas. We know that he laid down this concept of contemporary photography, valuing the real journalistic, documentary view of events. His way of doing layout and graphic design is also very well recognized. Usually people don't pay attention to such things as different angles. He took this famous high and low angle with this absolutely silly, absolutely small and amateurish Kodak camera. You know, if he wouldn't be a photographer, he would definitely be a filmmaker, because everything that he did had this sort of kinetic background. The way we walk around the street, the way we get into the streetcar, the way we are standing in queues. And Rodchenko paid attention to such very tiny facts of everyday life and activity, and he registered it all with his ability as an artist. So there are a lot of things that are important for us today, which were laid down by his talent.
Rodchenko's design work included posters and set design for his collaborator, the revolutionary documentary filmmaker Chiga Vertov, who was aged just 22 in 1917. Vertov was pushing the boundaries of experimentation with editing and cinematography. In Moscow, I met Maria Kulagina, an artist whose grandfather, for me, is a true hero of the revolutionary period.
Густав Клуцас действительно был очень известным художником своего времени. Он встречался и работал вместе с такими именами, как Родченко, Малевич.
Klutzis was from a peasant background in Latvia and moved to Moscow before the revolution as a fully paid-up member of the Communist Party. He's seen here, having taken part in the Battle of Moscow, in Lenin's car in the summer of 1918.
Klutzis was one of the major figures of the generation. He was the inventor of the so-called photomontage. Our entire family is an artistic family. My parents, my grandma and granddad, my children, and my husband too. Everyone is an artist.
Maria told me about her grandmother, Valentina Kulagina. Married to Klutzis, she was also a pioneering artist.
She also did a lot of posters where she worked independently, as an artist in her own right. First of all, they all believed in the new political regime. They absolutely believed that everything would be great. Socialism would win, that communism would come, and it would be something totally new. And their art was in line with this. They wanted to destroy the old and create the new.
The new political freedom won by Russian women after they got the vote gave them equality and a platform for their art. These artists flourished in the revolutionary climate.
Non-objective creativity is a movement of the spirit, a protest against the narrow materialism and naturalism that has begun to control life. This has been particularly characteristic for Russia, where our smart young painters have come to negate the object in painting. And this is understandable, since Russia has long been a country of the spirit.
Varvara Stepanova, who came from peasant stock, was aged 23 at the time of the revolution and was married to Rodchenko.
It's interesting how they could live together, because it's always difficult to find peaceful coexistence of the two creative persons.
In my compositions, geometric abstraction plays a key role. Color, sound, and form come together, arming the imagination.
Revolutionary politics and art also influenced architectural engineering. The constructivist radio tower in Moscow was designed to broadcast Lenin's propaganda to the masses.
Tell me about the tower.
This is a Moscow radio and television tower, but the main name and more, how can I say, understandable name for everyone, everywhere, is the Shukhov Tower, of course, because it's the name of the engineer who created Vladimir Shukhov. It was the dream of Vladimir Shukhov before revolution. He started to make kind of the calculation and start to thinking about the design of the broadcasting tower, because he understands very well it's the future of the human civilization. Start to transmit information to the big and long distance.
Советская власть есть путь к социализму, найденный массами трудящихся, и потому верный, и потому непобедимый.
In a vast empire with a largely illiterate population, Lenin cleverly used the avant-garde artists again to spread the message of socialism.
So they created these agitational trains, which were covered with avant-garde paintings, and they included some posters. And in the carriages, they would have lectures, and they would show films.
The filmmaker, Chyga Vertov, was taking part in this propaganda program and spent 3 years running a cinema car on the trains.
They would go to all over the Soviet Union and tell them who Lenin was and why Marx was so important. And trains played a major role in this process.
Alexander Rodchenko embraced this new artistic medium of agitational design.
They were agitating for literacy. If you remember the famous poster with Lily Brick shouting books, you can understand what I mean. So it's a very strong image, a very strong agitational image, which is copied by now everywhere. So it turned to be an icon of agitation.
In my exploration of the museum stores, I found this rare agitational propaganda, kept out of the public eye in Russia since the 1920s. These prototype collages were developed for posters and festive street decorations.
Revolution and art and politics are very much connected. So artist is not somebody who creates his own life, but he is on service on the revolution. You must obey the population and you must obey the party, you must obey the revolution.
This new propaganda art brought many people to the Bolshevik way of thinking, but others disagreed with Lenin. So, with revolution came civil war, the Red Army pitted against the Whites. With the government over-requisitioning grain and 2 years of drought, another era of mass starvation developed across rural Russia. Cannibalism was rife, and up to 10 million people died.
The revolution was a big problem. Basically, it was a total disaster for many people. And artists only, they tried to build a new world and try to feel themselves part of this. But the reality was very poor.
Меня поражает Петров Водкин тем, что у него получилось сделать из совершенно простых сюжетов вещи, которые стали символами. И дальше он постоянно чувствовал вот эту разницу между тем, что он выражал в картинах, то есть высокой нотой революции.
Он был глубинно русским человеком. И именно это удержало его в это искореженное время в Петербурге, голодном, холодном, условия, в которых приходилось работать в Академии художеств, вызывает оторопь.
This tragic deprivation fueled strong anti-Bolshevik feeling among the population. In 1921, after the suppression of a massive rebellion, there followed a wave of arrests across the country.
The Red Terror was announced by Lenin because he realized that in order to keep order in the country full of disillusioned people, hungry and cold, you had to scare them somehow and introduce some form of terror to make sure that they obey party orders and that another revolution, counter-revolution, doesn't occur.
There was a cultural exodus across all fields of art. Russia would lose many of its most talented artists, who were forced to flee their homeland, some never to return.
Кандинский, его творчество после революционного периода, оно скорее несет все-таки оттенок тревоги, беспокойства. И вот его работы конца 10-х, начала 20-х годов, они не несут в себе оптимизма. Это самое, пожалуй, главное, что определяет произведение Кандинского перед его отъездом из России. А это был 22-й год.
The more frightening the world becomes, the more art becomes abstract. The nightmare of materialism, which has turned the life of the universe into an evil, useless game, is not yet past. It holds the awakening soul still in its grip.
When he fled to Germany, Kandinsky was forced to abandon some of his best and largest canvases in his Moscow studio. In 1923, Marc Chagall also emigrated. He joined many of his fellow countrymen in France, where he experienced more artistic freedom, but his Russian roots remained all present in his work. The Bolsheviks won the civil war, but the Russian economy was now in tatters, and industry was at 1/10 of its pre-war level. Lenin needed to resuscitate the Russian economy, and the artists would be key.
In 1921, Lenin introduced new economic policy called NEP, trying to bring the small trade back. Cooperatives were opened again.
Private tradesmen and state companies were competing to sell their goods. Many of the posters designed by artists like Rodchenko were marketing their products. This idea completely contradicted the principles of communism. They were literally selling peasants back the grain they'd grown.
Workers, do not be afraid of high prices and new economic policy. Buy cheap bread.
I eat cookies from the Red October factory.
It was successful, except that it meant that you had the danger, from the Communist Party point of view, of redeveloping capitalist elements in society.
You are not a Soviet citizen if you do not invest in the national airline. 1 golden ruble makes everyone a shareholder.
But there was a growing dissatisfaction with the leadership. In 1922 saw an assassination attempt when Lenin was shot. Incapacitated, he was still leader, but unable to exert power. Russia's next ruler was already waiting on the sidelines, bringing with him his own version of communism and his own ideas for art.
When Lenin dies, in January 1924, this is a great opportunity for the Bolsheviks to substitute a different kind of religion.
That religion was the cult of Lenin, and it was initiated by his successor, Joseph Stalin. The cross was replaced with the hammer and sickle, and Lenin's mausoleum in Red Square became the people's place of pilgrimage. Even Petrograd was renamed Leningrad. Russia's artists were put to work by Stalin, creating statues and imagery, this time of Lenin. But Stalin forced many painters to turn away from the avant-garde to the style of socialist realism, a new form of propaganda depicting an ideal world of industrious Soviet workers.
The Bolsheviks had realized that there are artists around them which could be more useful for them than those crazy avant-garde artists who were doing something which politicians didn't understand and didn't feel that this is explaining or transferring to the minds of the people the existing official ideology.
Stalin was very keen on artists, and he cared a great deal about them because he saw them very much as engineers of human souls, in a famous phrase that Marx had used. He thought that art could be used to persuade people to adhere to the system, to participate in public life.
This portrait was painted by Pavel Filonov and marked a huge swing in his style from abstract to socialist realism. Censorship by the new regime also hit Sergei Eisenstein. On the day of October's premiere, Stalin came into the editing room and forced him to alter scenes that didn't fit his political agenda, including cutting out Trotsky, his political rival.
There was a great period of inventiveness that came just before and after the revolution. But it was really that inventiveness that Stalin wanted to stifle. And he didn't want people who were revolutionary and who would continue thinking creatively and who would come up with alternatives to what he was doing. What he wanted was unity. And he wanted everyone to think the same, and he wanted them to paint in the same way. And the avant-garde, because they were, by definition, people who thought creatively, were a problem for him from the very beginning.
This shift in thinking saw the return of the Academy of Art in Leningrad to its centuries-old traditions.
They understand that they need to have all these, emblems of empire. Classical school, with architecture, sculpture, and traditional techniques or traditional style and traditional, and then it's changed. And for Academy at that time, it was, a very good period because they came back to the past.
Either you want to become official artist and get state commissions and richly paid by the state, you do official art. But if you want to be an individual, you become a nonconformist. If you're able to do it, you stay with us. If you're not, if you don't want, we don't care. You go to the other door.
Идеологические ограничения, которые накладывало государство на работу художников, оно надломило Петрова-Водкина. Были строго регламентированы сюжеты, мучительный поиск нового типажа, который должен понравиться заказчику. Это болезненное состояние, оно подрывает художника, его творческий потенциал иссякает.
It was a big battle in the field of art, initiated by the party, and the realists, people who painted real objects from real life, the academy, in the old sense, they won. And people like Malevich, they didn't. But he forced himself to do it, so he tried to paint realism.
He turned into the area of figurative art, also understanding that he has in his hands the means which are not abstract, but which are expressing something very similar to what his abstract works were expressing, and again expressing the drama and tragedy of time.
And would you say the artists of the avant-garde were victims or vanguard to Stalinism?
It's hard for me to say that Malevich himself was the victim of what he had invented. He had reflected the need of the time more than maybe any other artist in Russia.
We need lots of letters from artists pointing out the incorrect bias in the artistic policy that is being pursued by many comrades and which is leading art in a fatal direction, despite the party's resolution that all trends have a right to develop. At the present time, during the building of socialism in which all the arts must participate, must art return to a backward position and become figurative?
Malevich and two of his students, Suetin and Chashnik, who were both important avant-garde artists, worked in the state porcelain factory, but they weren't happy doing Stalin's socialist realism. Here alone, they were able to continue creating with their suprematist designs.
Тогда денег не было, ничего не было. Значит, это единственное место, где можно было создавать форму, которую они, так сказать, хотели создавать. То, что Малевич создавал вот эти чайники и чашки, Суетин то же самое, там вазы. Это же все фактически супрематические формы. И это единственное место, где можно было спокойно все это делать.
In decorative arts like porcelain, a certain leeway was possible, and there were abstract designs until quite late. Easel painting became the arena where government control was exerted most strongly.
Other artists embraced this new socialist realism, like the painter Pyotr Kotov, whose style was known as Russian Impressionism. His work would be useful for the new regime. Normally, he painted rural scenes. But in the period of Stalin's 5-year plan for industrialization, when they wanted to convince the world of Russia's industrial prowess, Kotov would gain many new state commissions.
Организовывали специально поездки художников советских, какие-то так бригады, которые посылались на эти стройки. Иногда он ехал, оставался, во-первых, там больше срока, вот, или возвращался уже потом, не успев там что-то дописать, дорисовать уже по собственному желанию. Такие работы, конечно, невозможно было продать никому, кроме государства. Однажды ему, между прочим, одному из первых предложили нарисовать портрет Сталина. Он спросил, а сколько сеансов я могу рассчитывать? Ему сказали, вы что, сумасшедшие? Какие сеансы? Фотографии? Все. Он говорит, ну я не пишу по фотографиям, я пишу только с натуры. И он отказался писать портрет Сталина. Все потом боялись, что за ним придут, но как-то пронесло. И все кончилось благополучно.
In 1937, Stalin addressed the Russian people.
Можете рассчитывать на то, что товарищ Сталин сумеет выполнить свой долг перед народом. Перед рабочим классом. Перед интеллигенцией.
Stalin's decrees actually resulted in what became known as the Great Purge. In the year that followed, hundreds of people would be shot every day, and the population of the Gulag prison system rose dramatically.
The definition of who was a political criminal changed so much and evolved over time. It meant that really almost anybody could go there, and the fact of its existence served to make people afraid. It made people cautious about what they say, what they thought, and of course what they did, and in this context, what they wrote or painted.
There started to come the decrees signed by the highest state authorities to destroy these collections of the art of the avant-garde. The specialists from the State Russian Museum, they kept them behind the door, which they painted and put plaster on it. So nobody knew that behind this wall is a real door and is a real storage. But many of the works which were in Moscow and many of the works which were in these regional museums were burnt and destroyed in the 30s and even as late as 1952. I heard some of the museum directors who worked at that time in those museums, what they were doing, that they were taking the canvases from the stretchers, hiding the canvases, putting them like sheets of paper, and burning the stretchers.
Secrecy still remains over how much of the avant-garde art was destroyed and how much the museum curators helped to save. But a lot of it survives in this store in Moscow. Here I found another treasure trove of art, much of which rarely sees the light of day, by artists like Gustav Klutzis.
Собственно, я считаю, что Клуцис очень верил новой власти. Он надеялся, что действительно мир изменится. Клуцис очень хотел эту работу сохранить, потому что началось время гонения против формализма. И он принес эту работу в Третьяковскую галерею. Она у нас долго лежала, и, в общем-то, собственно говоря, она сохранилась.
It's not just the art that struggled to survive through the Stalin years. Many of the avant-garde artists themselves were declared enemies of the state and were victimized along with their work.
What happened to the artists? Really, many of them, as well as writers, poets, scientists, went to Gulag or were executed. But you should understand that this had happened to every second or every third family in the country. Like, if you would ask me, the two grandparents of my daughters were victims of the regime. One was shot in 24 hours as a German spy, another one, my grandfather, spent 20 years in Gulag.
Stalin's purges lasted for decades, and many artists would not survive. Nikolai Punin, the commissar who championed the avant-garde through the revolutionary years, was arrested and taken away. Many of the artists were exiled to gulag camps in the frozen reaches near the Arctic Circle, making escape and communication almost impossible. There, they were put to forced labour in the name of the socialist cause.
По дороге в Вологду, пересыльный пункт, и Николай Николаевич письмо удалось ему послать из Вологды. Он бросил в окно вагона. Кто-то подобрал это письмо, и, слава Богу, его прислал нам. В этом письме он писал о том, что он на пересыльном пункте, и сейчас предстоит самый трудный этап до пункта назначения. Куда, он не знал. Когда он приехал в октябре в этот поселок, то уже тогда оттуда письма шли достаточно быстро. Но можно было написать только по одно письмо за полгода. Зимой там морозы очень большие, там снег выпадает до 7 метров. И суровый климат, конечно, сказался на состоянии здоровья Николая Николаевича. Он умер 21 августа в 12:20 дня.
Others also suffered.
Была всемирная ярмарка в Париже, и Клуцес делал павильон советского искусства. Он там блестяще выступил, и после этого казалось, что его путь будет только все лучше. У него был огромный творческий потенциал. Но когда он вернулся, прошла в это время как раз началась волна репрессий. И он, как будучи латышом по национальности, попал под эти жернова истории.
Густав Клуцес, который Сталина, по-моему, он лучше всех показал. Он такого аскета, такого очень мощного. И вдруг власть его арестовывает, как врага народа. Это произошло в январе 1938 года.
Along with the Klutz's art, I was able to uncover these arrest files in KGB archives and not made public until 1990's perestroika. Klutz's, once driven through Moscow in Lenin's car, was now vilified for being the first generation of Bolsheviks.
Я уже видела его профиль, знаменитый профиль, когда его фотографировали в ГУЛАГе на на страшных фотографиях в профиль и в фас. Все творчество, вся жизнь были посвящены просто полностью. Люди были преданы революции, преданы Сталину. То есть они не понимали, что происходит, почему это происходит с ними.
The documents from the Soviet era also reveal the full horror of suffering that prisoners were subjected to. In order to gain confessions to trumped-up charges, severe beatings were commonplace, as well as starvation, sleep deprivation and psychiatric torture.
Очень длительные были допросы. И как я, собственно говоря, читала эти документы, это, конечно, просто было чудовищно. Если раньше они были от руки написаны, подписаны были, то потом уже просто на машинке напечатаны были. И видно, как он расписывается, уже такой, уже рука у него роспись ставит так тяжело. В ночь 26 февраля, когда отправляли вот партию арестованных на расстрел, его, по сути дела, не было. Клуцис погиб во время допросов.
What saved Rodchenko from my point of view was that in the 30s, when these political reasons were the main reasons for judging in art, he was doing such things that were absolutely needed. He was taking photography because the magazine USSR in construction with which he cooperated, it was an international magazine printed in 5 languages.
You know, the Rodchenko photographs were meant to be propaganda photographs, and they show men hard at work and interesting, new-looking, sort of modern angles on this canal construction, and there are people playing instruments and so on. But the White Sea Canal was publicized as a kind of socialist project. You know, this camp is going to reform criminals and capitalists, and it's going to make them into good Soviet citizens. And it was really a propaganda response to criticism that came from the West and from inside the Soviet Union about the camp system. It was a show camp, if you will. It was designed to be photographed, and artists were sent to paint it, and writers were sent to describe it.
The quality of his work helped him to find jobs. But what was evil in all this situation, it was that not artistic reasons were announced for separating good from bad, but political and ideological reasons were announced. That was a great harm to art and to artists, because nobody could feel himself safe.
Хотя вот я всегда говорю, что я ночной человек, потому что вся жизнь с детства у меня была ночью. У меня родители, вот папа и мама, они жили ночью, потому что ночью приходили за... И когда ночью тишина, каблуками, если человек идет, очень слышно. Поэтому вот прислушивались, идут или не идут.
By 1949, Suetin's time had come, and his name appeared on the list of people to be arrested. But first, the chair of the Union of Artists was consulted.
В первых строках была фамилия Суетина. Когда он увидел эту фамилию, он сказал, ну вы-то уж совсем с ума сошли. И вычеркнул его. И, собственно, это спасло папу.
Нам сейчас кажется в наше время, что реальной опасности для Петрова-Водкина не было. Потому что, во-первых, он считался своим социально. Он же был не из дворян, он был из рабочих и крестьян. Во-вторых, он всегда был очень осторожен в политических высказываниях. Он не выступал ни с какими политическими декларациями. Он просился по состоянию здоровья за границу в 1933 году, в 1934 году, но больше его не отпустили.
Pyotr Konchalovsky also survived the purges.
You know, before I thought that he made a mistake. I thought he should have gone to Paris, he should have gone, he should have stayed there, and he'd have been known in the West. And now I realize I was wrong. He thought if he would stay here, he would be more free to stay where he is than to go in the West and be unable to sell himself.
Another artist who finally remained in Russia was Kazimir Malevich. Despite his work being banned, he escaped the purges, dying instead of cancer in 1935. Meyerhold was strongly opposed to socialist realism, and in the early 1930s, during Stalin's repressions, his theatre was closed down. He was arrested in June 1939, brutally tortured, and finally put to death by firing squad. The photographer, Victor Buller, fell victim himself to political change when he was shot by firing squad, falsely charged with espionage. Other artists who'd collaborated closely with the regime were lucky and survived. In 1953, Pyotr Kotov was to gain his final state commission, that portrait of Stalin.
За ним, за Котом, приехала машина, сказали, собирайтесь, Петр Иванович. Кстати, отказываться уже было бесполезно. Ну, собственно говоря, собрал все свои краски и отвезли его в дом, колонный зал Дома Союзов, еще несколько художников, и он таки написал Сталина с натуры, но в гробу, чему он был очень, ну, если это слово подходит, рад.
The art produced in the revolutionary era of Russia has outlived both the artists and the politics.
I think the legacy was that it existed. It was wonderful art. It's a young art which didn't feel that any borders do exist. And so they presented wonderful examples of this. It's a change, but it's a great example which brought wonderful masterpieces in the collection of Russian art and made Russian art once again famous and good. Avant-garde always fights classical museums, but avant-garde inside always wants to be part of this museum in the future.
Even one of the most iconic works was once mothballed, hidden away in a potato crate. It's now worth millions and hangs in the State Hermitage alongside Da Vinci and Rembrandt.
Malevich Black Square was a story, an anecdote. Nobody really knew who he was, and it was all hidden and destroyed, and only in intelligentsia circles it was known. So he was the myth. He was a mythological figure himself, as well as many other people like Kandinsky and so on. In contemporary art, of course, when it was possible, when the Soviet Union was starting to collapse, the artists trying to come back to these stories, and non-conformism became now official art and like the best art of the country. It's not anymore a prohibited fruit that you have to strive for. It's just a part of the history now.
All this big exhibition of Russian avant-garde in New York or London, in Paris, of a certain period was connected with some ideas of changings in Russia. It was connected with these changes. The country is not changed totally, but it were some changes, and avant-garde was on the banner of these changes.
What the artist created over 100 years ago was far more than just a utopian dream. It's outlived Russian socialism, and its influence surrounds us today.
It was a generation of artists who produced some of the most breathtaking images and who went through and experienced some of the most terrible times. And in a sense, their heroic struggle, both with the past and with the present as they experienced it in Soviet Russia, is an inspiration today.
Maybe as such a concept, it could be and it is of interest, but also I think that everybody understands that that was a political coincidence, that the state supported this because at that moment that was the only way of spreading the ideology around. So I don't think that anybody wants this to be repeated again.
In their pursuit of a new art for a new world, the artists of the Russian revolutionary period have left a lasting legacy which has transformed the world of art.
I have destroyed the ring of the horizon and escaped from the circle of things, from the horizon ring which confines the artist and the forms of nature. Forms move and are born, and we make newer and newer discoveries. And what I reveal to you, do not conceal. And it is absurd to force our age into the old forms of time past.